Hello everyone, thanks for joining in. This webinar we will be talking about ROI from data and analytics. I'll begin with a story. Mark Smith was a CIO of a manufacturing firm headquartered in Chicago. He had joined this firm in January 2020, right before the pandemic. And now he's on his way to the quarterly review with the CEO. The past quarter has been a very eventful one. This was the time when the organization's first data science initiative went live. When Smith joined, the organization was doing pretty good in business intelligence. They had extensive reporting in place. At that time, the business users asked for more. They said, can we tap into predictive insights and make better decisions? One of the challenges which Smith identified, which was topmost for the business, was machine failure. Being a manufacturing organization, this was one of the topmost priorities on how to avoid downtime and ensure continuity. So this was posed as a challenge to Smith, and he identified what is required to launch the organization's foray into machine learning. And they picked the first project as predicting machine failure. And this project went live in the last quarter. It's been 2 months since the teams have been using it, and the initial reviews have been pretty good. The business users were very happy, and to the surprise of the technology team, the adoption was very smooth. And what really surprised some of the plant managers was that the algorithm was able to identify some big ticket failures weeks in advance. They were able to avoid the downtime. So it was celebrations all around that here's a technology solution which is helping us do our jobs better. So with that, the teams had collected all of these metrics, the model accuracy, the user feedback, the efficiency improvement, and all of these were tabled. And that's what Smith was carrying in his deck. And he was about to get into this quarterly review with the CEO. Pretty confident he walked into the meeting. That afternoon, he found out that hardly 5 minutes was spent on this predictive project. The CEO had just one question, which unfortunately Smith was not able to answer well. What was the question? When will this predictive project break even? Now you might wonder, when you have great outcomes, efficiency improvements, what would be so tough to quantify benefits from this initiative? But you might also be surprised to know that this is a challenge that every single data leader faces in the industry. Every team that takes a project live, they have posed this question: what did your project return? And when will it break even? It is not very easy to answer this question. And that's why this session is very important. You learn 3 things in this session. Number 1, why is it so difficult to measure ROI? Number 2, a 5-step methodology on computing returns from your investments. And number 3 is how you can apply this in your organization, taking these learnings forward. Quick introduction, I'm Ganes, co-founder and chief decision scientist at Gramener. At Gramener, we solve business challenges by bringing in insights, stories, and taking it live on our low-code platform. We work with over 100 clients, the likes of Microsoft, Deloitte, globally supported by a 250-member team. I am passionate about simplifying data science for everyone. I have spoken in stages like TEDx. I contribute to magazines like Forbes, Entrepreneur. And one tidbit about me, I am collecting data to build my own personal habits. I share a lot of this and I've been blogging about it. So that's one personal quirk. So let's dive into the first part of the session. Why is ROI so difficult? And let's try to empathize with the situation that Smith and his team are going through. The state of the industry is that there's a lot of money being invested into advanced analytics and AI. You hear this very often in the industry. And a recent report says that on average, large firms invest about $38 million in data and analytics. What is not discussed as much is about the returns generated by these investments. It is not very encouraging. The returns are low. And what's even more shocking is that 79% of these firms don't report considerable or even positive ROI. Over half of these organizations don't have a place, a measure to find out how to compute ROI. So those are the challenges the industry is grappling with. There are three reasons for these issues. Challenge number one, data doesn't often lead to outcomes. It's a long chain with high chances of failure midway. First, you have your data. Organizations extract insights from the data by applying analytics. This is where descriptive analytics, machine learning, AI come in. And then you convert those, visualize them using dashboards, data stories, and identify those recommendations which the users can then consume. It's important that the users understand that and put it into action. And finally, the actions should lead to outcome. This is a chain I was talking about. It could be broken anywhere. Often, organizations have a lot of data. They file it away, but they don't really tap into the value. Data, when it is just stored, doesn't realize its potential. Number two, insights. When you talk about insights, people often present model statistics, accuracy. They are not really insights, and they're definitely not useful insights for the business teams. There are a lot of dashboards, but very few actionable insights which can be prescriptive. Today, dashboards have turned into glorified Excel sheets. And finally, actions. Even if you share the actions, they really don't connect to a workflow. They are very isolated, and over time, users stop using it. When you manage all of this and do all of these things right, you deliver the outcomes, but often the mistake is they don't measure these outcomes. So that's what I mean by a very tenuous chain, which is often broken. No wonder that 80% of projects don't deliver outcomes in the industry. This is a quote from Gartner. Challenge number two, when you manage to do all of these things, the problem is outcomes are often notional and they're not very quantified. This is exactly the problem with Smith was facing in our story. We often hear about technology teams talking about higher efficiency of their solutions, or this enabling better decisions, or even improving the branding for the organization. What does this all mean if you're not able to put this into a quantified number? I like this quote, a measure is worth 1,000 expert opinions or even perceptions. So quantification of these notional outcomes is challenge number two. Challenge three, even if you quantify in dollar values, the next challenge is whether all of these benefits, are they really caused by your project? Identifying that causal connection is very difficult. A popular example is that of Disney Plus. So they launched in November 2019 with an ambitious goal of 90 million subscribers by 2024. Within 14 months, they beat this target. Now, how much of this you will attribute to their brilliant marketing strategy, and how much of it is just a windfall from the pandemic, with people sheltered in their homes with little else to do? So that's the third challenge. To summarize, number one, data to outcomes is not easy, often gets broken. Number two, outcomes are notional, they're not quantified. And number three, even when you quantify, how can you attribute and say that these benefits were really caused by your problem? Let's find out how you can measure ROI. Before that, I would launch a poll. I'd like to understand your opinion. Let me trigger this poll first. Yeah. Please answer this. How many of you have quantified ROI for your data and analytics projects? I see some responses coming in. Understandably, there's a lot of curiosity around how to do it. I see a lot more no's so far. We'll give it a couple of seconds. And meanwhile, if you have any questions, like Sanish mentioned, do put it into the chat window. I think we'll try and take it when we pause for polls. Otherwise, we'll answer all of them at the end. Let me close the poll and share the results. 78% say no. Understandably, there's a curiosity for this session as well. Okay, let's move on. Let's talk about the second section, which is about measuring ROI. And this is the 5-step methodology we've identified at Gramener. Firstly, you need to understand that yes, data is intrinsically valuable. However, you will have to monetize it either directly or indirectly. Otherwise, the value is lost. People often talk about data being the new oil. So if we extend that analogy and we say oil has relatively less value than it is in the crude form, you need to refine it and then you can monetize it directly or even indirectly. There are many avenues to do that. So similarly, data, numbers, and the raw format it is in, it has intrinsic value, but it will be realized only when you monetize it. When you talk about monetizing value, there's a lot of interesting work. The discipline of infonomics, Doug Laney and Bill Schmarzo, there are some leaders in the industry who have done some very authoritative, great work on monetization of data. And they argue why data shouldn't be an item in your assets. So that's the monetization of aspect of data directly. There are several ways to do it. The second approach is indirectly, where data can deliver value by enabling your business outcomes. That's the focus of this presentation. We'll talk about the 5 steps that you can tap into the value through these indirect measures. So we have what we call the SMART framework of 5-step methodology. Step 1 is to define success. Even before you can quantify it, you'll need to be very clear about what are your strategic outcomes. What are you trying to achieve? Number 2, how would you measure them? What is the value and what are the metrics that you will use to characterize these success outcomes? Step 3, attribution. How can you definitively identify the impact of your project and isolate it from all other factors which could influence your outcome? Step 4 is identifying breakeven. Once you have these benefits, the costs, then you compute breakeven. And finally, benchmarking. Benchmark against your other projects, against the industry, against competition, and continuously improve upon it. So while I'm walking through each of these 5 steps, I'm going to be using an example again from manufacturing. So I'm going to present this side by side. So we looked at this framework, big picture. We'll look at the context of this manufacturing problem. Then for each of the steps, we'll look at how this manufacturing client had applied it and put it into practice. So here's the context. This is a beverage manufacturer with a fairly global presence. And the challenge they were facing was this. The cost of bottling had been rising steadily over the last couple of years. And this is something they have been observing across many of their regions, many countries. So they turned to data and analytics to solve this problem. And the approach is fairly straightforward. Number 1, diagnostic analytics to identify what are the cost drivers and come up with recommended improvements based on statistical analysis. And number 2, use machine learning and build a visual command center which can run scenario-based simulations, assuming the cost of, say, a particular raw material, carbon dioxide, increases by so much, or water increases by so much. So how does it impact your overall cost, or if there's fluctuation in the labor cost? So you want to run all of these simulations. And we're just calling our manufacturer company's name as Trinket. This is again an example inspired by our work. Uh, so we'll look at more details for each of these steps. Step one, we talked about defining your target outcomes, defining what is really success for you. There are 5 different categories of strategic outcomes you can target. Financial is the most obvious one. We talk about revenue uplift or cost saving. Additionally, you need to balance those quantified financial indicators with other uh, factors such as organizational performance or efficiency improvements. So you need a combination of both. Earlier, we talked about why just those non-financial measures won't cut it or notional measures won't cut it. You need a combination of both. And you also have these other pillars: customer, stakeholder, and innovation. We'll look at the different attributes under each of these outcome categories, and you will need a combination of outcomes to be picked. So what are the next level attributes for each of these 5? Under finance, the indicative ones are revenue, margin, cash flow. Innovation, the mix of new versus existing products. Innovation culture measured through indices like innovation index and so on. Stakeholders, employees, investors, the larger community. Customers, customer experience, business value generated for them. And from an organization standpoint, the operations performance, brand equity, if we can quantify that, and even ESG. ESG is a critical one we're starting to see across many of our clients. For example, carbon footprint is one thing organizations are methodically measuring, and they want to impact and improve upon that. So when you have a mix of these and you're very clear about it, even before you start the project, that can be very empowering. Now, if you look at our example for the beverage manufacturer, what does it all of this mean? So their strategic objectives, they finalized 3 of them. 1, optimize the global manufacturing cost. Number 2, improve employee and resource utilization, which falls into the stakeholders pillar. Streamline manufacturing process with multi-level visibility. You start at the regional level, go down to the country, individual plant, and across cross-functional view. So this falls into the organizational category. Now, the target audience for this was plant manager and regional leadership. So now the strategic objectives, 3 pillars we have chosen: financial, employee, and organization with these attributes. So that was step 1 and how step 1 was implemented in this example. Let's move on to step 2. Once you have the outcomes, you need to pick those strategic measures of impact. How are you going to measure? What are the KPIs or metrics? So for each of these 5 pillars, there are some indicative metrics we're showing here: revenue growth, gross margin, operating expense, receivables or payables when you want to track cash flow aspects, innovation, like the examples I mentioned, innovation index, revenue from new products, stakeholder when you talk about employees, attrition rate, satisfaction, or for investors, stock price, return on equity. For customers, the customer satisfaction score, lifetime value, acquisition cost, share of wallet. Organization, the time to market, process cycle time. So all of these are the most common indicators. You can come up with a long list and pick the relevant metrics based on your industry and your scenario. All of this has to be done even before you start the project. What we recommend at Gramener is when you identify a project and you're trying to get approval for it, you identify all of these as part of your charter that you build, and you project the ROI and secure funding approval on that basis. So in our example, the metrics picked by the the beverage manufacturer. So cost saving, the most important metric here was the bottling cost, the cost per case or cost per bottle, and the production, the line cost per plant. And then other costs, they were measuring people empowerment and employee productivity. And carbon footprint was one important thing in terms of their responsible use and for the environment. So they identified these success metrics. While there can be many measures you're going to be tracking throughout the project, you need to have these strategic success metrics, which you agree with your stakeholders that this is what your project is going to be measured upon. The common mistake we observe in the industry is people you usually come to the metrics as an afterthought. After the project goes live, they initially track only the adoption and those the obvious efficiency metrics. And then when they are questioned about the ROI, they start scrambling to identify what is that the dollar value. At that stage, it will be difficult to get consensus. In the early stages, when you're planning the project, that's the right time to have the discussion and get consensus with your business stakeholders and ask them, what would you consider as a success metric for the project? Those are the discussions and those are the stages you need to have the discussion. So that was step 2. Now step 3. Once you have identified the metrics, and let us say you've started measuring, you collected all of the data, and now you want to find out, is your project really moving the needle? What really led to the results? The first step you need to do as part of this is to list down all of the factors which could influence your outcomes. Simple fishbone diagram would do, where you list down all of the potential categories of factors. And then under each category, you go down to the individual details and say, these are the measurable metrics under this factor, which could influence my outcome. That's a very important step to lay everything on the table, because what you will find here, and we will often come across in our project, is once you list down these factors, you will discover that 1 or 2 factors you don't have data for. That's an important discovery, and which is why this also you need to do it early on so that you can set those systems and process to collect data. Imagine if you do this 3 months after a project goes live. If you start collecting new data for some missing items, then it's time wasted. So you need to identify the factors wherever data is missing, institutionalize processes to collect the data. And next step is to determine the attribution. So as part of attribution, there's a popular technique called A/B testing. In case you've come across this already, it's a very popular one used by tech majors like Google, Netflix, Amazon, to find out what is really working with the industry. What color should my button be? Should it be red, which will make users click more on it, or should it be blue? So all of that is done through A/B testing at scale. Given that there are millions or even billions of users, it is very easy to do this testing. The methodology is fairly simple. You split your target users into 2 groups. One set of users, you give them the new scenario. In our case, you give them those new analytics enabled insights and tools to make decisions differently. Whereas for the other group, you let them do the business as usual, however they were doing earlier. So now with these control and reference groups, these are the 2 groups we've created, A and B. When you measure the results with everything else being the same, if there is an improvement in your group where, for instance, you've isolated A and you've applied your analytics process, that 3% uplift you're getting in the improvement is because of your analytics initiative. So that's how you identify and you isolate it, and you need to carefully choose a group, split it into 2 likewise similar groups, and then design this as an experiment. And this, once when done right, it can be great proof to convince all of the stakeholders. But the reality is that this can't be applied in every scenario. In many enterprise situations, either you don't have enough data volume, or you don't have enough. For instance, you have one plant where you're going to be launching it, and it's a small company. What if you don't have another plant, or even within the plant, you can't split it into similar A and B groups? So there are situations like that, or in some cases, it might not just be feasible to split, or you might want to launch it one shot. So in those cases, there's an alternate technique which was inspired by Judea Pearl, the Turing Award winner. So in his book of why, he talks about this technique, and this was subsequently implemented by Microsoft. So you can, so the approach here is again pretty simple. You use those diagrams to identify the direction of impact and the relationship between the different bubbles, and you lay down what all you know are the measurable factors, and if there are factors which you can't measure, you list them as well. And then through statistical techniques, you will be able to adjust, apply it, and find out what is the level of influence of one known factor on the outcome. So this is the second option where you are not able to apply A/B testing. Both of these work very well. You'll have to choose depending on your scenario. Now, in our example for the beverage manufacturer, they identified all of these 4 categories of influencing factors. There was this material cost, the bill of materials, looking at all the labor, materials cost, transportation cost, and all of these employee related factors. And then there were the manufacturing process related factors. And finally, there were these market factors, external influences. Some of these are known, some of these you don't have data for. All of these were laid out on the table. And then A/B testing was applied. Here I was talking about this being done at across multiple countries. So it was possible in this case to identify and isolate different plans and run this A/B tests. So that's step 3. Step 4 is break even. How do you compute all of your costs and benefits, and then you identify and measure these heads? We earlier talked about the gain heads, the financial ones, and the non-financial ones. We looked at these other categories. Cost heads is an equally important piece. When you talk about measurement of cost for data and analytics project, what do people usually remember? The cost of software, cost of the team building it, and hardware, infrastructure, other cost. But there's a lot more to it than those obvious factors. You need to go for the non-intuitive ones and stuff which can actually hit you and can actually surprise you later on. What are they? Number one, from a people effort standpoint, apart from the technology team, you need to look at the effort spent by the business team. And there's a huge change management effort. McKinsey in a report says that almost 50% of a project's budget has to be allocated for adoption. Just think about that. Most organizations spend lion's share of their budget on implementation and maintenance. But this report says that those organizations who have got the best outcomes from data analytics, they had set aside 50% of their budget for adoption, all of those software aspects, the workflow changes, training, and continuous process interventions. When it comes to technology infrastructure, hardware, software, infrastructure, those are the obvious ones. But increasingly, organizations are using machine learning platforms, or they are subscribing to APIs. These are the silent killers. When you subscribe to an API, it is most likely priced based on your volume. And you might assume a certain volume and factor in a certain cost. But a year down the line, assuming your business takes off, and you have the volume probably 10 times to 100 times that you anticipated, then some of these solutions actually might become unviable because the API has become so expensive. So you need to identify what are those variable, the non-variable costs, and find out which of these are recurring and compute the total cost of ownership. Similarly, capability building initiatives, the data initiatives, assuming you want to run data literacy initiatives, which might be actually beyond this immediate project, but it actually influences the project aspect. So maybe you can apportion a part of the cost to this project. And finally, opportunity cost. This is something which people again miss. You'll have to look at, assuming you're putting in, say, $2 million into this project. What is the alternate option where you would have invested this $2 million? And what is the return that would have generated? And when you subtract from that the return from this option, let's say this is returning you $1 million, that would have returned you $1.5 million. Then this $500,000 is something that you need to add as an opportunity cost. So that's how you bring in all the cost heads together, and then you compute the break even. So in our example, when you look at all of these costs, 4.25 million is the total cost head for the all the ones that you can measure and put together. The gain heads, we have the measurable financial ones, which comes to $4 million as the benefits of savings. And then there are these the qualitative benefits, which we are still retaining. We should not do away with that. We just have to project them. Just that wherever you have these qualitative benefits, try and see if there is an associated financial measure. If possible, does it translate to that? For example, customer satisfaction, increase in customer satisfaction by a certain number of points. Does it translate into incremental revenue? Wherever possible, link it back to the financial metric and then bring it into the tally. So this is how the example it plays out. And final step is benchmarking the performance. So like I mentioned earlier, you need to do this across all the projects running in the firm, against competitors and against the industry. There's great value in this step because you can find out how are you doing versus all of these benchmarks. This data is hard to come by, but it exists. A recent report shared the payback average payback for advanced analytics and AI initiatives. So these are the payback time in years across industries. You can see that it's relatively longer for healthcare compared to automotive. Manufacturing, the example we are talking about is 1.32 years. And this actually varies across the maturity of the organization and technology. It's very different for beginners versus leaders. If you are an organization that is just embarking into analytics and particularly advanced analytics, you're likely to take a little longer. If you say the average is 17 months, which is what this report found out, for beginners, this report says it could be a few months more, about 20 months. Whereas for leaders, you can shave off a few months. So this is a good starting point, and there is obviously more to it, more benchmarking you can do and compare. In our example, we've already computed the cost and benefits, and the break even here in this case is about 1.2 years, which is better than the manufacturing industry average, which we saw in the earlier slide is 1.32 years. So this is how the 5 steps have been implemented in this hypothetical inspired example based on actual work we had done. So hope this example with the 5 steps was useful